So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Jukes, other than there was this notion of Pauperism. And Pauperism involved being poor. And clearly you can see this as kind of an assault on the poor. And it's another story, but a lot of these people were cement miners. During about that time, what they mined was natural cement. There was a discovery of Portland cement, which was not nearly as good as natural limestone cement. But the problem with cement that was used prior to that time, which still is the best cement in the world, called Rosendale cement. I'll advertise for it, help my Juke brothers out, is that it takes about 2 weeks to harden. Portland cement, or artificial cement that was developed about that time, you could pour it and you could work with it as a solid product the next day, et cetera. And so very shortly, Portland cement put the cement mines where these people worked out of business. And so at the time when the Jukes were studied, they were dealing with people who were in economic collapse because of the failure of the cement mines. Interestingly, those cement mines, like there's entire mountains that were hollowed out by these Juke miners, today house all of the underground records for the New York banks, for Standard Oil. There's an entire city, atomic bomb-proof city, underneath the ground in this hollowed out area that was actually built by the Jukes. So if we have a nuclear war, know that your bank records will be safe. There will still be a record if you owe the bank any money, and you can thank the Jukes for that. But they were principally being criticized for intermarriage, and of course for having defective, handicapped children. So as a Juke 100 years or so later, I can tell you proudly that I've got a handicapped kid and an interracial marriage, and we're still the same people we always were. I won't go all through Dugdale's findings. The one thing I will point out is that I think it is quite famous that Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes made this decision about the sterilization and whether it is constitutional, and that decision was influential in the development of the Alberta Act and other acts as well. But 52 years earlier, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., his father, actually was writing about eugenics in the Atlantic, and again, picking on those Jukes. So we're still at war with the Holmes clan. So in 20th century eugenics, we started to get further emphasis on race, more refined views of intelligence, belief in deterioration of the intellect. And one of the things that was really interesting was, as soon as we sort of got this idea of intelligence being something we could test and measure, we got the idea that somehow everybody was getting dumber, okay? And so this was partly driven by the fear that all of a sudden we were producing large numbers of people with less intelligence. Now it's interesting because we could never measure it before, and some people will say that we still can't measure it now. But as soon as we started to measure it, we assumed that it was getting worse, okay? Is anybody here familiar with the Flynn Effect? Basically what the Flynn Effect says is we're getting smarter. Nobody knows why we're getting smarter. If you actually look at intelligence testing and the standardization of intelligence testing, they have to keep re-standardizing tests because people's scores are going up. And it's irrefutable. Sort of the initial reaction, it's happening all over the world, okay? And it seems to be happening in spite of all these reasons that people say that we need to wipe out people in order to counteract the effect that our intelligence as a group is going down. It's a huge effect. It's not a small effect. It's basically about one standard deviation every 50 years. This basically means 100 years ago that the average person would test what would now be as mentally handicapped. Some people have tried to say, well, maybe it's because of education. Maybe it's Sesame Street, etc. Interestingly, the strongest place you can demonstrate it are on things like Raven's progressive matrices that are entirely non-verbal, non-cultural, etc. So that this effect is actually strongest in measures of intelligence that are not affected by culture and learning, etc. And why is it happening? Well, I think we need to ask ourselves, when I started work here, I was tall. I have probably, actually shrunk about half an inch. But when I get on the elevator now with university students, they're all taller than me. And it's not just that I'm getting smaller, they're getting a lot bigger. And if you look over 100 years, the average height has increased drastically. And why is that happening? We can sort of say, well, maybe there's nutritional reasons, maybe there's all these reasons. We don't entirely know the reasons. But in the same way that we're getting taller, we're getting smarter. Here, this is only sort of relevant because part of what was driving the eugenics movement was the belief that just the opposite was happening. And so in the 20th century, we had mass institutionalization, sterilization, and in some cases, we had actual euthanasia. And so we had, for example, the T4 program in Germany, where people were actually put in the gas chambers, and the first gas chambers were actually developed in the euthanasia program, and it was both the equipment and the personnel from the euthanasia program that then went on to create the death camps like Treblinka and Sobibor, et cetera. So when they got the process down, they thought maybe there's all kinds of other undesirable people that we could get rid of. Sterilization is the most obvious form that was practiced here in Alberta. However, it's not the most prevalent form. Institutionalization, in fact, was the major tool of eugenics. And stopping people from having children by locking them up in sexually segregated institutions throughout their reproductive years was practiced not just in Alberta, but across Canada. And the only difference is that it was easier to justify that in some other way. However, if you look at the discussions about the creation of institutions in Canada, the United States, the intent is entirely clear that the purpose is primarily eugenic. We also had it, and this was a shock to me, I grew up thinking about Clarence Darrow and the Scopes monkey trial, et cetera. If you actually look at Hunter's civic biology, it's a eugenic tome that I think we would find kind of disgraceful. But it's interesting that that aspect of it is not sort of carried forward when we look at sort of our liberal traditions and how that battle was carried out.